agely. So what we're going to do today is we're going to work a little bit and acquaint you with the school census. But the main thing I'm hoping again that you realize is everything you can put into your brain about the specifics on these kinds of materials are part of your toolbox. The more you can remember, not just that you should seek a particular type of record, but that you know some things about it, so you have some intuitive ways of going about it, not only in Montana, but in other states. That's what's really important. So what I'm going to do now, we're at 11:03, and I'm going to go to my share screen, and maybe Gary, if you're around, or you can be around for a while, if you notice that someone else is coming in. Right now I've got 10 participants, and we'll just see. I'm going to the share screen because I want to just acquaint you with a couple of things that you have available to you. You're actually going to have 3 different things available to you. This one, can you see it? It's called the school census handout.
Yep.
Now, Jan Boyle is saying, yes, she can see that.
I can see that.
Yeah, I can see it.
This is not everything, folks. This is just representative of things that are there. There are things from various counties, and I'm telling you where you could see them. This first one, the Anderson County, Kentucky thing, you could see as a manuscript on microfilms out at the Salt Lake Library. On the other hand, if you go down to the 4th item, this one that I'm highlighting here right now in red, you could, if you wait a week or 2, you'll see it in our library because people are finally publishing stuff like this. This is 25 years worth of Boulder County, Colorado, District 2, listing more than 1,000 students across that time. On the other hand, you need to know in this presentation today, even if you're not from Cascade County or your family wasn't, our library, our Great Falls Genealogy Society library has all of these records available for all of the county beginning 1896 through 19. Well, it says they're filmed actually and out online through 1955, but we actually have everything through 2006. You'll see things like books, like this next one, the rural school districts of Dawson County. We happen to have that book available, so those things are there. On the other hand, I've tried to give you some ideas about, well, here's Garfield County. I just got to highlight this one in Montana because they call theirs the unbook, unauthorized, unorganized, unofficial, uncensored, uncertain, unbiased, and unfinished. But they have their school census records in there. I thought that was just kind of fun.
Cool.
You're of course aware of many other kinds of things. I want to highlight for you today where we really, even though we've had things available to us out online, people don't always think to search for records like registration of city school children, a consideration of the subject of the city school census. This happened to be a New York Columbia University 1910 thing. I want you to think on 1910 because it's where we really attempted to begin looking at what was available and what states were doing. I'm going to highlight that for you today, not because it's the only thing at all, but again, because you have to have at least some data point that you can begin to look at and begin to think on, and you can say, well, by golly, I know Jan gave us a fast overview of some of these things. There were theses done, there were dissertations done, various kinds of things. So I'm just highlighting a few of these things on this sheet. I'm not going to spend any more time with it than this today. I'm going to go back and stop the share so that I can show you another one real quick. Let's see where I'm going here down at the bottom. I want to share the screen again. This Nystrom summary, if you've got it later on, I'm going to refer to what was recommended in 1910.
Oh.
And so at the end of a dissertation. And so it's actually only one page. It persisted in wanting to go to 2 pages. And so I'm not going to fuss with it, other than the fact that when you run it out, it's just one page, but it tells you what some educated people, experts thought at that point we ought to be sharing. And let me tell you, it's still not all being shared today because it depends again on your history of your Civil War, the history of what happened in New England first, the history of what happened in Minnesota and Michigan later on as we began to get some ideas about things. And then how did schools become funded, or how weren't they funded? And so, yeah, you need to enlarge your perceptions. Montana's laws, I can tell you, by 1911 were pretty standard for them. They did a good job, at least, of looking at and saying, this is what county superintendents of schools need to be collecting and then keeping. And so you have a reasonable idea in Montana of being able to look at those things. And when I talk to you about these, I want you to realize that one of the things that we're looking at here is we're looking at some model documents and then some not so model documents and getting an idea of what all ought to be out there. And so I'm going to go back again, hopefully, to my share screen and go to the actual presentation now. At the end of the presentation today, I don't know if Mary has sent stuff to the people in Helena yet, but there's this total presentation that I'm giving you, but not in presentation format. Not in presentation format like this. Hopefully you can see this. This thing will be available to you with the notes from the beginning. Can you all see that? Okay. So we're going to talk today about using school censuses for genealogical purposes. And the notes for this will be available to the Great Falls people after this. I'm sorry I didn't get them sent earlier, but puppyhood prevented me. What do you need to know and why? First of all, what I'm concerned about always is you're gaining in skills. That's part of the toolbox that I talk about all the time. I'm interested and I want you to invest yourself, hopefully, in learning skills, not just learning that a particular type of document like a school census might be available just so you could ask about it. But if you are going to another state, if you're going within state, actually, you need to know enough about what you're asking for that you know whether you got it or not. You need to be able to analyze that local context and generalize to other local contexts. What you see in Texas, what you see in Louisiana, what you see in Virginia may be different or not. I'm aiming at increasing your knowledge overall of different kinds of documents so that you're doing more than just saying, I've heard about school censuses. Do you have them? You need to know enough that you know what you're looking at. First of all, a school census today is usually an annual account. Note I said today. You're going to see that sometimes they were on 10-year counts, 4-year counts, 5-year counts, or whatever, depending on states in 1910, 1911. Your ancestor should be on a list for a certain specified time period in that year. Why is that important? In Montana, it was usually taken in August, September, and available by October. Later on, it changes to an October count. Today, it's unofficially, for us anyway, an October count, although for the state, it is an official count, and the state actually keeps the information today. So at about 2006, you won't be able to ask the local district or the local county for a document that you could look at right there. You'd have to be asking the state, and it might take them a while to get back to you. But what information can you get from a school census? It's so important. You can get parent information or guardian information. One of the most important things I can think of is you get a specified time frame when that list is available and that list tells you whether or not the people were there. That's why you want to look, if you can, at the original information. If you can look at the original information, you may see that sometimes people are lined out with a date, meaning they left on that date or whatever, if you're fortunate enough to see that. In our county, I can tell you, you will see that kind of information. In Lake County, Montana, that's going to be different because they very proudly, and they did a good job overall, although I can tell you, not for one of my brothers, but they transferred the data by year over to cards, individual cards about kids. Why is that important? Well, mine in Lake County is fine. My brother Cons is fine. My sister Mary is fine. My brother Mike is fine, although it doesn't record all the years. I teased him about that and said maybe his brain wasn't there. But for my brother Gary, they totally missed his birth date by month and by day. So it would not be a good place to look for his birth date. And I would have to confirm that elsewhere, probably from his birth certificate. Oh, by the way, that's another thing that's available in Montana is the birth date. Very, very important. And some kind of an address. Usually it's going to be very generalized. For us, it says Ferndale near Big Fork. And you'd have to know that Ferndale is 4 miles up the road on Highway 87, I believe it is, from Big Fork. So what background information about school census could help you, and why would it help you? Why does it help you to begin to get knowledge about these things? Nothing drives me more crazy than having people say, no, I don't need that particular thing because my person is from Minnesota, so the information from Montana couldn't possibly help me. Yes, it can. It can help you big time because you need to learn to generalize that local context and put it into the context in another state and say, would they be the same or would they be different? And where am I going to go get that information? So local context and the state history of censuses is very important to you. The more you can learn, the more you know that if, for instance, you don't have a school census every year, like you will not have down south, you still have this other thing that says the family was there from, how about the local taxes? They had to be paid every year. So increasing your knowledge about this and saying, well, we don't have that every year down in Alabama, but we do have taxes. They got collected every year. So the address is going to be there. I won't have the kids maybe, but I'll have the proof that the family was there or the proof that the family moved because nothing's more sure than death and taxes. And they wanted to collect that money no matter what the state was. So even if you'd moved on, if you still had land there, the next address is likely to be there in the taxes. That's right. So school census data, I just want to talk a little more about it, how important it is to you. Right now, it's conducted yearly at a prescribed time, usually in the fall, and sometimes actually twice a year, because as we sensitize ourselves a little more to move-ins and move-outs or big projects that come in, like Malmstrom Air Force Base project or whatever in our county, it's going to be there. It's only that today, beginning in 2006, the state collects that because the student gets one number one time in our state and across other states too. And I'll acquaint you with a thing called the NCES, that is the National Center for Ed Statistics framework that can help you today. But usually you'll see a surname, the first name of the student, the first name of the parents, and the guardians. And this is beginning by 1896 in Cascade County. It actually began before that. I've found things from Choteau County for our people who were at that point District 9, beginning 1885, 86, 87. And so it was reported there because we were a different county name at that time. At least the age of the student, but probably the birth date of the student, the address of the student and the family. I warn you, in Great Falls in 1896, it reports it by kind of the attendance center. It won't tell you what school they attended. That's not the purpose of a school census. It just tells you that there were kids who were available in a district in Montana between the ages of 0 and 21. That's right. We had probably one of the best laws ever that said, okay, we don't just want to know the ages of the kids who are in school. We want to know who would be available for school so we can begin to build different buildings, different places in our town. So we had about 10 different attendance centers in 1896 when you look at our report. It's real valuable if you can look at the original data, because a strike through could indicate a move out. And other data, they'll write data in the margins. These school clerks were just great. So if you get a chance, read the notes. Look at the notes for everyone, not just looking for notes about your family. That'll tell you what that person was fond of doing. You'll also like it because they're verified by school clerk oath, which meant something. And then, of course, the data went on to the school superintendent of schools in Montana, and then it went on to the state superintendent of schools, so that the state could begin to say, I'm just going to the next screen that says, to use the school census data, you need to know even more than just some basic information. Can you guys hear me?
Good.
Yeah.
Okay. You need to go out and look at the state law for the years per state, because before about 1930, they differ. And the time of year in which they administered things, some of them administered them in the spring, and of course the kids were gone by fall. So you need to look at that. If you're in another state, who was officially named to keep the data? Could they ever discard the data? And if so, where did it go? I can tell you in Montana, there were a few counties. I went and talked to the county treasurers and the county superintendents of schools. Oh, it's been about probably 8 or 9 years ago when they were having a meeting, and some of them said, well, the data was tossed before they ever got there. So they, some places have it and some places don't. They probably should not have gotten rid of it. You have to look at the law from year to year. What data got collected, and you want to, if you can at all, you want to be able to see the original verified census. Again, Lake County did a great job. There's a card for every kid. It just goes on forever and ever. And by the way, Lake County, Montana published 2 beautiful books on the schools of their county. Just gorgeous stuff. There's 32 pages on my little school of Ferndale up by Big Fork. It's unbelievable. But when you recopy data, I want you to remember, just as in any other census, when data gets recopied, what happens sometimes is mistakes are made. Witness my brother, who is reported as being born a full month beforehand, and there was not even, he's 5/26 is his original birth date, and it's like 4/21, so it's not even close. So you always want to know, was that census recopied? Because then you can use this data really well. And where was the school census information distributed? Did it just go to the state and was that it? Did you find a newspaper story by going out to newspapers.com to look for the story about particular county resources? Do you know your particular school by name, like Centerville, but actually Centerville, Montana gets reported by 5 different small census pieces of information in just recent years, even like 1950. Why? Because they all contributed kids to that school, which became centralized. That's not why Centerville was called Centerville, but that's what happened there. So the school census state laws track the growth and the decline of school populations. And the reason they want that information is, of course, so that the legislature can properly distribute money that they put together for school censuses. So the US government has something to refer to. I know it may be hard to believe sometimes when you look at the US Congress and you say they just seem to be, stalled in terms of things. Maybe they are with making laws, but they do have things like the NCES, the National Center for Ed Statistics, which operates all the time to collect that information across schools, across school districts, even comparing us to other places in the world. Depending on what kind of information Congress says that it needs to have. It also, one of the most important things that the NCES does is it provides uniform definitions across the state, across the nations. Finally, and even then, somebody will say, well, isn't that the same as this? No, it's really not. I was very privileged to be a National Center for Ed Statistic Fellow for several years. There were at that point 2 in each state. And I got great training from that particular organization and got to see what they were doing as they actually began to put together that list of uniform definitions across states and nations and so on, so that we could even compare ourselves. Because many times when you've seen school comparisons, uh, things that were being compared were not necessarily comparable because they didn't have the same definitions for particular things.
Mm.
One of the most important things it does, however, is it tracks an individual student, providing a uniform means to safely and securely, finally, transfer student data and school records among schools. That's one of the primary functions today for students in Montana, for example, or students in Washington or California or whatever, actually getting one particular student ID, not their social security number, so that it's very easy if students transfer among or between schools, even within the same district, that data can quickly and safely and securely be transferred. So teachers and principals have that data available to do the very best for that particular student. It also collects data for school funding appropriations, the distribution of funds by uniform statute per state, and it's used for certain mandated funds by the US Congress when we begin to look at different populations, special education populations, and so forth. And by the way, the United States began actually looking at that kind of data, not school data, but began looking at the data they felt they needed by 1830. They began collecting certain kinds of data and they began standardizing the language across, what were the farm definitions they needed? What were the manufacturing definitions they needed? What were the definitions for mortality schedules and so on? And finally, really beginning to put that together by 1880, 1890, so that then they had some means to say, this is what we believe states should be doing when they collect their individual information. And of course, school statistics came along there by about, well, you see 1910, 1911, you see some big studies happening so that people even knew what was going on across states. One fellow managed to collect data across 46 states, and that was great information. That's a very nice study, and it's available to you out online. I've given that to you on one of your handouts. The evolution of the school census, there was an early form of school census taking in the New England colonial towns, so they could determine seating capacity, building capacity, because what they didn't have was they didn't have a lot of teachers early on in the 1700s. And so what they would do is say, okay, this area of our county gets a teacher for 3 months. And then that teacher is going to go someplace else for 3 months. So it was very important for them to be able to say to a teacher, okay, you have some 6, 7, and 8-year-olds that you're going to be teaching for 2 months over here in Weymouth or whatever. There were 30 different types of apportionment reported in early Massachusetts. So you can see it was many, varied, and unusual. And changes were often made just locally, just to be able to take care of the local situation, because there was one thing everyone was sure of. They wanted kids from an early age on to be able to have some education. When we talk about it in education today, we talk about an act that uh, just said kids should be educated, and we call it the old deluder Satan law. I won't go into it more than that. But as a result of that, we had to count kids in some way. We had to know the specific students who were available to school and when they would be available to school. I'm going to focus today for you for a little while on Nastrom's study in 1909, 1910. He went out to see what methods were being used across the states. He was able to get a lot of information from 37 states. He actually was able to look at the facts for 46 states for some things, but there was no consistent standard. Let me show you what this looks like. They needed data for apportioned school funds. That was decided. They wanted to provide some uniformity, and they discovered they really couldn't because they had to get some definitions together first. But their intended need was to provide data to state legislatures, county administrators, and so forth for how many buildings were needed, who should be in school, who's not in school. About that time, about 1906 to 1911, 1912, child labor laws in the United States began to be a force across just some of the states. And so they were saying, hey, who should be out there? According to our state law, this kid should be in school until he's 16. Why is he working for the telegraph service at the age of 14? And they would go to the telegraph service and say, you're abrogating the law. You need to get this kid back. He cannot be employed by you during the day. He can in the evening, but he can't during the day. Mm. Those are actual things, by the way, that happened in Montana. By the way, both in Great Falls and in Helena, when you look at the newspaper records for what was going on with child labor laws in about 1911. I know I've done the total a total index of our students in Great Falls for 1911 so that I could see just who all was available, because the index comes in terms of one section that treats the kids from age 0 through 5 in one section. And then there's another section again for those at 12 through or 6 through 21. So that's a little bit of what Montana looks like. His particular study, he was able to report on 46 states who had some type of requirements, even though there was no one definition for proper census age. In Montana, it was 0 to 21. Other places, it was just a limited number of years. 38 states required the age of the child. 9 states required the birth date. The birthplace was required by 3 states. The child's gender was required by 25. Their color was required by 14 states in the South. Nationality required in 7 states. Literacy level in 3 states. Who actually was attending school in 13 of the states. The names of the parents were required in 25 states, the addresses in 20. The geographic distance from a school. By the way, that had to do with beginning to think of, do we need a school bus? And if so, how would we afford that? Vaccination data, 1 state. But by the way, across the world, most other places required vaccination data for their students by 1911, whether or not they had that smallpox vaccination. Mm. If you were married and you were still under 21, you got excluded from the data in 5 states, but not from Montana. We kept track of that. If you were state institutionalized, like at a Montana School for the Deaf and Blind, we still included that information in our local census, but several states did not. Indians were excluded if Indian parents were untaxed, and that had to do with Indian citizenship, or our idea of Indian citizenship, ironically. The number and the name of taxpayers got included. Another way to get those taxes, students, if they were employed, their employers. And by the way, you can look at that right up through 1940 in all states. They were asking if you were over the age of 14 in the 1940 census, were you employed? So they were still trying to get a handle on that. 18 states wanted to know if you were blind. 19 wanted to know if you were deaf. 10 wanted to know if you were deaf and dumb. 7 wanted to know if you were feeble-minded, and so on. So you can see that state reports included certain kinds of information. Uh, a few wanted to know, 4 states wanted to know if you were illiterate and you were over the age of 12. Ohio had probably some of the best reports on classifications, and they still listed every student. 16 states, including Montana, allowed the state superintendent to ask for other census data that he or she felt was important. The local assessor was said to collect the data in 4 states. In ours, of course, we had a school superintendent of schools for the county that reported to the state, that reported then to legislature and the governor. Some states used census trustees. Some kept the old idea of the U.S. Census using a census marshal. Some used a town truant officer. Some used police. West Virginia had the teachers take the census. Only 28 states said you had to make the report under oath. And guess what was happening? People were reporting more students than they had so they could get more money. So then they discovered they had to be reporting each name and each parent and so on. 30 states penalized work if it was done incorrectly, but it had to be discovered that it was done incorrectly. And there was not necessarily someone to monitor that. So there's all kinds of data that was there. When was the school census taken? Well, in Montana and in 36 other states, it was taken annually at a certain time, whether it was fall or spring. Let me tell you how important that can be. We've used the school census information before per one of our members to help that member prove that he was in the school district and his parents lived at a certain address so that he could get some money that the state had identified at large and was going to take and put into the state treasury. He got that particular money because it was reported, as we have a report every spring saying this money's here, it's finally going to go into the general fund if nobody claims it. Let me tell you again how important it can be. What if somebody committed a crime and in Montana, you could see that that person and the family at least were listed at a particular address during 18 days in September. Wow, that gets it down. You can put it on a timeline and you can say, we could prove that they were there and they had not yet moved to another town at that point. They are not lined out. So it's another piece, not necessarily standing by itself, but it greatly increases knowledge with regard to the possibility of a person being in a particular place at a set time. You need to ask who keeps the records or who kept them at a certain time. In Montana today, we used to have a school superintendent of schools. Very few of our counties still have that. Usually it's the treasurer who makes the report in the place of the superintendent of schools today to the state superintendent of schools and onto the governor's office and so on. And then it's, of course, reported to NCES, the National Center for Ed Statistics, which is part of the education for the United States. Why is it reported there? Because even though the U.S. government does not have control of all of the school monies, it has control of some kinds of school monies that can be distributed. So they need to have good information. You can see who kept the records before. There was a state superintendent in all the states except for New Jersey and Minnesota in 1911. Pardon me, 1910. In Montana, the state law in 1909 required the enumeration of all students, including those absent from home. So even if a person had married, you're going to see this neat little thing saying married, living over in district blah, or whatever in Montana. For a long, long time, you're going to still see that in 1950, which is another local school census that I've been indexing recently. So I know about that one. In 1900, the US Census, during the 1900 census, started looking at school census records to cross-check US Census information. It was informal, but this is the beginning of a more serious look at the information for better governments at the US level, so they could provide information across the states to the states, all the way back in 1900. The National Center for Ed Statistics is part within the US Department of Education. I know when I was there as a fellow, it was very lean. I believe it had 72 employees. It has like 90 employees now because of the efficient way in which it can collect information across the states. It provides information year round, not just at a certain time of year. So you can go out and look at its center. It's separate from the US Department of Education. It has its own neat place for you to look, and I've provided that for you. I've provided a place for you to go look at their YouTube videos. They're all very short. They are the federal entity for collecting and analyzing the data related to education. Congress can pretty well ask it anything, and it will go back and reanalyze its data for a particular period of time or for that year or whatever because of the things that it's analyzing. It produces a thing called the Digest of Educational Statistics by year. It's available out there, full text, free. If you've ever wondered why people are able to get an idea of what's going on state by state, this is a good place for you to go look. It defines common measures. It defines common definitions and more, actually. They have another thing called the Condition of Education, which is a congressionally mandated annual report that gives key indicators from pre-kindergarten through post-secondary. It provides international comparisons. It shows you trends based on what Congress wants, labor force outcomes, and all kinds of things. I can't begin to tell you all of the things that are out there, but it does some pretty neat stuff. I again have said your YouTube videos are available there. Going to nces.ed.gov, programs COE, and that's for the Condition of Education, COE. Today, local and state data in Montana, and I'm just using that as a reference point for you, recognizing again that you can, right from 1636 forward in Massachusetts, you can begin to look at types of school information. It won't necessarily be a school census, although Harvard does name every one of its students as it began in 1636. Most Montana counties do have their data dating back to the time of county creation. Some have given those older reports to local museums, or we understand at Great Falls, in our Great Falls Genealogy Society library, we have those reports for Cascade County. They are on, quote, I would call it kind of permanent loan to us, but we understand that the county fathers are the ones who still own that data. And they've been greatly helpful to us in terms of ensuring that we have that data and so on. And so you can look at that. I've been busy indexing some of those just again, because you can't just until the late years anyway, you can't go through and look at information. And for Montana, you would have to know that every single report for any county is going to consist, right up through 2006, it's going to consist of 2 different reports. So don't think you have the total report for a family if you have one list. They may only be in the 0 through 5 report, or they may only be in the 6 through 21 report, or they may be in both, making it really, really a good thing if local societies, local people are willing to index that so people see it all in one. Many still have the reported data available through the county clerk and recorder or through the treasurer. You have to look both places or ask both places. And if they don't have it, you might want to ask your local museums. I'm telling you right now, it would be wonderful, wonderful to have a countywide alpha list of the students all in one with their parents, their age, their birth date, and address available for the 50, the 60, the 70, the 80, the 90, and the 2000 school censuses. That would be a great project for local places to do. Just again, because it offers people the opportunity, especially in those US Census years, to look at the differences in the data. Who was born? Who died that year? You get those indirect references within those systems, and you also find people moving. 1950, 1960 especially, there were many people moving across the United States. And if we have the 1950 and the 1960 censuses indexed, guess what? We have a great way of looking at a lot of the population for a particular county, even though we don't have access to those two US censuses yet. The states took over their own local data and took it from local responsibilities in about 2005, 2006. That's the end of that particular part of the report. I'm going to go back to share with you briefly. I want to go back to that neat Nystrom report that I gave you there, where I said by 1909, 1910, there was an idea of what should be there. It's a one pager for you if you look at it, but Nystrom said, after looking at the states and what the states wanted, who and how many are of school age, that would just be a numerical report, wouldn't it? Who and how many are of each year of age within the school age period? Well, that's another report. And Montana reported on that too. The school superintendent in 37 places in 37 states across the United States had to know that information too. So there were reports within reports, is what I'm telling you. Some very, very valuable things. Who were of compulsory school age? Let me tell you how important that is. In Montana, if you were in 1910 and you were a teacher, you could expect your classes to increase in January of each year. Why? Because our state law at that point said if you were a child who had turned the age of compulsory education, that is 6, by January 1, you were entitled to go the second semester. So you got these new kids in school who hadn't been in school before, second semester, and there you were with a class of 40 anyway, and it wasn't always fun, folks. Well, guess what? At the high school level, it was the same thing. If you were a kid who had passed the 8th grade exams sometime around Christmas, you were entitled to enter that second semester in most every state across the union. Wow, look at what that does to you in terms of deciding who was going to be in a first semester or a second semester class in freshman English, for example. We still have that today. You're going to witness schools across Montana today and across other places where kids complete their high school education at the end of the first semester in a year, and they're entitled to go on. They can go elsewhere. They're done with school. They're counted not in the data, other than they're counted as graduates at the end of the year, and they can go through graduation if they want to at that time. But most places still have the ability to have those kids graduate. I know we do in Great Falls. They graduate at the end of the first semester and maybe off to something else, military service or off to college or whatever. So it became important for them after the US censuses for 1850 or 1860, 70, and 80 especially, to know how many kids were physically or mentally incapable of attending school, even though we didn't really do anything about that till 1975, when we began with specialized services for more than the deaf and blind and dumb? Uh, how many were at work? Because lots of kids left work. I know when I first came to Great Falls, people, it was 1970, I admit it. Nobody thought a thing of kids dropping out at the end of the freshman year or the sophomore year when they were 16 because you could go get a good job down there at the refinery. And so we had a larger than usual. You might not think about it, but we only had about 65, maybe 70% of our local kids actually making it through high school at that point because you could go get a good job elsewhere. And so they were doing that. We didn't get to high school completion being something super actual graduation until later in the late 60s to early 70s. And then we've really had to work at that across the state. People forget that many times. How many weren't at work and weren't in school and were out there maybe hell raising and they weren't incapacitated, but they were just non-attending everywhere? How many are without a natural means of support? Who needs help, in other words? We were beginning to think about that by 1910, 1911. In fact, if you look locally in Montana, 1911 is what I call the year of the playgrounds. Go out and take a look at your local districts and you'll see why. Suddenly, the idea that kids needed to have playgrounds, even if it was the older kids, that is from age 9, 10, 11, and so on, that there ought to be school grounds, playgrounds available for them and playground equipment. Great Falls went out, built 3 playgrounds, got playground equipment, and then said, who's going to pay for this? Because the district wasn't. They had to raise special money in town that first year to be able to get that. But after that, whenever we built a school in Great Falls, guess what? There was playground and playground equipment. Isn't that the coolest? That just really is. So how many of school age or about the age of 12 are illiterate, no matter what? How many leave school each year? The grade at which they leave, the number of years they'd actually spent in school, and why did they have to leave? Did they have to help mom and dad support the family? Was the family breaking up or whatever? They were looking at these things in 1910 and sharing that data across all the states finally with this wonderful study. This last one just gets me. And then finally, who and how many of school age became criminals each year? The nature of the crime, the school and the employment records of each, and who got sent to someplace like Miles City, because you could see it all over. Guess what? In 1910, they could still give you the names. Those didn't become available later on, but you can look in the 1910 newspapers and find out who was regarded as just so truant and such bad acting that they sent them away. We also had a girls' school by not long after that. So they were looking at that. I can tell you, by the way, that the seminal study that was done on when and how kids learned, theoretically anyway, to become criminals was actually done. The study was done in Great Falls Public Schools in 1984. Gives me shivers down my back to think about it. Terry Pavlonis was one of the special education teachers here then. She went to court and managed to get a look at the records, although all the records had to be, we had to make sure that no particular person could be identified. But it was interesting to see that in certain families that had been identified, where the adults had been identified as having some kind of criminal activity, sometimes by the 2nd and 3rd grade, you could begin to see that those kids were not reading. That's why we have this important push for reading by 3rd grade, being able to read at a certain level and so on, that they were not engaged in school, they were not engaged in activities. And those were important indicators for this community and other communities across the United States to begin to look at and provide early support services for those children on a sustainable basis. Before that, there'd been different kinds of projects that went for a year or two, and then the money had be gone, and so it had flowed off again. There wouldn't be any way to support it. But that's where it began to be important. Let me tell you how important that dissertation by Terry Pavlonis was. It won the dissertation of the year across the United States. It was paid attention to by the US Congress, by various bodies. It's helped a great deal in terms of identifying early preschool information that we need today. We know that if we can get kids in early, that we can interfere with certain lifestyles. We can give them other kinds of things, and we can give them the educational supports they need year round, not just during the school year.
Can you spell that again? Terry?
It's been a pleasure for me to be able to talk about this. The only state that I know of besides the state that I can tell you across the United States that has provided their school censuses out online for, I'd say, half their counties is South Dakota. That's kind of an interesting one. You can go out and look at that out um, at familysearch.org, because they were the ones who made sure that the data was available. They went out and looked at that data. And now I'll stop because we're right at 12 o'clock. I'm sorry we got interrupted part of the way through. Hopefully you're getting enough of an idea about how important that school census is that you remember this. It will not, unless there's only one school there, it's not going to tell you the name of the school where the kid attended. And that's good. Why? Because what you're going to get then is you're not going to get just the kids who went to public school. You're going to get the names of all the kids who were available to attend school in that county in Montana between the ages of 0 and 21, whether they're in a private school, a Catholic school, or whatever. You are going to get that information because it was taken across all kids. In 1910, 1911, if you pair the data, for example, after that, with the city directories that are available, you can see in the city directory who had actually gone off to, for instance, a commercial college like the Great Falls Commercial College at the end of 8th grade and was attending school there. You can see in the reports in December who was a freshman or a sophomore in high school but had already passed the 3rd, 2nd, or 1st grade level for teacher certification, because lots of school districts were teaching that as part of their home ec curriculum. Isn't that cool? And so you can begin to get an idea of who's there, who's having to go out and work, because they will be listed in the city directory. If someone has a job up at the refinery or got a job with the railroad, guess what? You're going to be able to key that back with a school census and say, but that kid was only 15. What's going on here? Well, he went out to work in the world. That's what he did. So the school census, anywhere that you can get the information, is very, very important to you in terms of being able to look at, was there, first of all, some kind of collection of data? And if so, what was the rationale for that data? If they were having to fund those schools, especially in northern cities and in states after 1866, then you can begin to see what the emphasis was on education for that particular place and who got recorded. It's another way to begin to look at a total family or to look at guardianships. I know we found one neat set of kids who lived in, I believe, either Nyhart or Monarch for years. Their parents had both died. People in that town took them on, and every year they had that family of 2 kids had a different guardian listed, but by golly, those kids went to school through the 8th grade. That tells you some neat things about the community. It tells you some neat things about the responsibilities that are felt, and it tells you a little bit about state law. I hope that you begin to ask about, if you haven't used school census data before, I hope you begin to use it. You begin to use it fully and look at what's available. Ask yourself those same questions we did when we were looking at what you needed to ask for a particular certificate. Ask what information's available and what information is there. I'm intrigued in Cascade County by the information I've been doing. I just completed all of the rural schools in the county on that school census, and I am struck by the number of kids who had guardians rather than parents responsible for them. And yet I can go back and look and say, oh, well, that dad died in World War II. and the mom died of TB, still a real big factor in our county at that point. So I'm going to stop now. I don't know, Mary, are you going to, have you sent that second one, or are you going to send it after this? I can't hear you.
I have to unmute. I've sent it.
Okay, great.
Okay.
And what I'll
Yeah.
do is I've got everyone else's name, I think, for Great Falls, so I can send you the information about that. And Michael, I got to ask, did I do okay? Michael's a former school person, so he's not going to answer me. He's on mute. He's staying on mute. I'll ask him later. But school censuses are just great. And of course, you know, we haven't gone through the other things, like we haven't done the school annuals for someplace like a Conrad or a Brady or someplace like that. The school annual is going to include every kid, not just the high school kids. In Great Falls, we're busy. Larry's had a special project. He's been going out to each and every elementary school here and asking for their annuals. And we're getting some of them, which is pretty cool. Or they're letting us know that they keep the total record in their local, in their little school safe. You know, we have safes in those schools, and they keep their annuals, etc., so that you could go look. At least most of them will keep a copy of that school annual, so you'll be able to go look at it. So that kind of information could be very important. That will take it down to the school level. However, the school census takes it down at least to the county level and allows you another look at the population and another look at the parents and their kids. So